Upon arrival, early American settlers began working on a small settlement cabin. Providing shelter for their family was just as important as food or water. The threat of winter resulted in a quickly but intentionally constructed cabin that would house the family until a larger permanent homestead could be completed. Dylan Wilson, the restorer and farm manager at the Center for Pioneer Life, constructed this replica alone to demonstrate a functional settlement cabin that could have been found on an early American homestead.
This is the settlement cabin that I'm building, and it's a replica of a cabin that the settlers was built when they got here from the 1700s on till the early 1900s, really. But when they first got here, and they picked their spot, whether it be by grant or however they got the land that they were going to set a homestead up on, they had to start immediately on shelter. And so they went to clearing the land for farm, and they would bring the logs with a team of horses or a single horse or a team of oxen and build a cabin. And usually the cabin was built right off of the ground. The first logs were on the ground, and they were chestnut logs. But due to the chestnut blight 100 years or so ago, we don't have any, so I had to lay rock to start our cabin. And they were dirt floored. They had a dirt floor in them. I've heard and read about people talking about they remember when their mothers would sweep out the cabin floor on the dirt floor, how they would make designs with the broom, with a corn shuck broom. But then you start with the logs, and the first cabins they built, because they were in such a hurry because winter was coming, they would build what's called a pole cabin. They didn't hew the logs out square and make them uniform. They'd have to peel the bark. Like I did these, I got a draw knife and peeled the bark off and started stacking them and making these notches. And I made two different styles of notches. The ones to right here are called dovetail notches. And then from then on up, they're called saddle notches, or that's what I've always heard the old timers call them. But the size of this cabin, it would be small for a family, but what determined the size is how big the logs were that one man could pick them up and stack them. Usually it was a settler and his wife and maybe some small children, but he had to stack these logs usually by himself. And a lot of these logs I can't pick up, but you have to just use leverage and just know how to slide them around to get them stacked. And usually the cabins just had one window in them because of heat. They were very cold inside, and they needed to keep the heat in. And I haven't got to it yet on these, but what they fill these cracks in the logs with is called chinking, and what they use for that is just red clay mud. They'd get red clay dirt right out of the ground and mix it in water and pack it in there, and that's what they also used to lay the chimney. And then it got up to the roof, and before they had access to a blacksmith or iron nails, they had to hew out boards, like these boards that I made for the door and the windows. I made them with an axe, and so they would split logs and make boards and stagger them up the roof to keep the water off. And also on the doors and windows, they didn't have iron nails, and they had to make locust pegs. And they would get a piece of locust like this and split it. And at night, when it got too dark to work, when they'd sit by the fire, they'd whittle out these round pegs because they had no nails. The chimney, like I said, they built on the back were out of field stones that they could gather from the mountainside or around their farm that they had to clear. They had to clear the rocks off anyway to be able to farm crops on it. And usually, I haven't started the chimney on this yet, but they'd lay up to about this high above what's called the firebox inside, and they were in such a hurry they would take locust poles and stack them like they'd build a little cabin above the firebox, and they would coat them with red clay inside and outside. And so the top of the chimney was made out of wood, actually logs, a lot of them were, and that's called a stick and mud chimney, but it was always above the firebox. And later on, when they got everything pretty much established, they could come back and tear it off and lay it the rest of the way up with rock. But a lot of times, I've heard the old timers talk about walking by somebody's house at night and where they'd laid the chimney with red clay, and the bugs and the insects had got in and made nests that you could see 1,000 little points of light coming out of the chimney. Now on the interior of this cabin, they had a sleeping loft on each side, and you heard me talking about hewing logs out square. That's the way these are done, and they're done that way. So I could square these boards out and put up puncheons, they're called, and put up for a sleeping loft to make more room down here. And these are called split shingles, and they're made out of, they usually would make them out of white oak, but these are made out of red oak. And I split them, and that's what the roof is roofed with. And you can look up through it all the way through, and you can see daylight in many places and light shining through. And used to, I heard the old timers talk about waking up and having snow on the bed after snow outside, and that's where it came in from. But I've been in here in the hardest rain you can imagine, and it doesn't leak rain. As long as you can look straight up and don't see daylight, it won't leak. But if you look at it from an angle and see daylight, it won't leak. The rain runs down, but the snow blows in. Although I think that they were pretty, they weren't made to be pretty. They were made as shelter quickly. And later on, when they got established where they were at and got everything, a barn built and a spring house and got all the other farm buildings built, they probably used this for storage, and they went ahead and built a cabin like we have up here, the Francis and Josiah cabin, with uniformly hewed logs and probably a better roof and better chimney.
Our mission at the Center for Pioneer Life is to preserve the legacy of the Southern Appalachian pioneer families who settled this region and experience how they lived.